Being pushed over the edge mentally is not just a modern thing, and here are 3 times it happened in history with some pretty severe consequences. Number 1. Jeanne de Clisson. It's the year 1300, and a red-haired baby girl is born to a minor noble family in Brittany. Her parents name her Jeanne, and as they lean down to look at their adorable newborn baby, they smile and say, "Jackpot!" You see, Jeanne was a beautiful child, a very valuable asset in those days. So as soon as she was old enough, her parents eagerly married her off to a noble in exchange for a whole lot of land. Being just 12 years old, Jeanne probably had no idea what love was, so she just went along with the plan and quickly had 2 kids with this guy and accepted that this was probably what her life was going to be. But 14 years later, her husband unexpectedly dies, and as a 26-year-old single mother in the Middle Ages, she needs to find someone else to marry to take care of her and her kids. She was still very young, and according to historical accounts, still super hot, so she quickly marries a member of the Breton ruling family. But his family thinks their guy would be better off marrying someone a little richer, and so they get the Pope to quickly annul their marriage. Jeanne then meets and marries another Breton noble named Olivier de Clisson. And this time, the vibes are completely different. Against all odds, in a time when marriage between nobles was usually just political, Jeanne and Olivier fall madly in love. They go on to have 5 kids together, and life is perfect. A loving husband, beautiful children, wealth and power. What more could you want? But everything changes in 1341 when the Duke of Brittany dies without leaving a clear heir, and the family feud over who gets to be the next duke spirals into a 30-year war called the Breton War of Succession. The kings of England and France both rubbed their hands together, spying an opportunity to ensure the new duke would support them in their own 100 Years' War. So the English support John of Montfort, the half-brother of the duke, while the French supported his niece and her husband Charles de Blois. Jeanne and her husband choose to support Charles de Blois and side with the French and their king Philip VI. Fighting for the French, Olivier and his army recapture the lost city of Vannes, but the victory is short-lived and the English quickly take it back. Olivier and other commanders there are captured, and for some reason he's traded back to the French for a suspiciously small amount of money, and this makes the French start to believe he's a traitor. The Pope comes in and calls a timeout on the war in 1343, and in this brief truce, the king invites Olivier and other nobles from Breton to Paris to participate in a tournament to celebrate the newfound peace. Olivier thinks this is awesome and travels to France, but the second he steps onto French soil, he's arrested and taken prisoner. He's tried for treason and thrown into a dungeon to await his trial. Back in Breton, Jeanne finds out about this, rushes to Paris, and desperately tries to get her husband released, even going so far as to bribe the king's sergeant, but ultimately fails. Olivier is given a sham trial, and in August, he's marched out to the town square and publicly beheaded. His body's then hung up in Paris, and his head was shipped off to Brittany to be displayed on a spike. Horrific for anyone, but for a noble to be treated like this was the ultimate disrespect. In Brittany, Jeanne brings her 2 youngest sons to look at their father's severed head. She forces them to stare at their father's pale, lifeless face that is now weeks old and is rotting and covered in a swarm of flies. Inside, she boils with rage and refuses to let her children look away. They must understand that the king must pay. And so, at the age of 43, Jeanne decides to dedicate the rest of her life to making the rest of King Philip's life a living hell. She breaks all ties to France and sells off her entire estate, land, jewelry, anything and everything she owned of value, and uses the cash to raise a small personal army. She arrives at Château de Tuffeau, a castle controlled by the French loyalists. She weeps loudly at the castle gates, asking for the men to allow a heartbroken widow entry. The commander of the castle looks down and recognizes her as a noble who supports Charles de Blois and opens the gates. Once the gates are open, Jeanne's army reveal themselves and storm into the castle. The castle garrison is caught off guard, and Jeanne orders her men to massacre them all. She spares just 1 man and gives him instructions to give King Philip the regards of Jeanne de Clisson. She continued to sack castles along the Normandy coast with her personal army, and eventually she buys 3 warships which she paints black and dyes their sails blood red. She names her flagship My Revenge and essentially becomes a pirate. She carries with her a massive axe and begins terrorizing French merchant ships in the English Channel. Her tactics are brutal, as she's not so interested in looting, her only goal is revenge on the French. The crew of every ship she targets is slaughtered, and she personally beheads every French nobleman she finds with her axe. Only 1 witness on each ship is left alive to tell the story of what had happened. As word of Jeanne and her Black Fleet gets back to the king, she becomes known as the Lioness of Brittany. Word of this crazy redhead with these black ships that's f***ing up French merchant ships somehow gets back to the English, and they immediately recognize her as a valuable ally and begin funding her to keep up the good work. But Jean's reign of terror couldn't last forever, and in 1348, the French Navy finally tracked down her fleet. In a brutal battle, her fleet is destroyed and her flagship is boarded. But when the soldiers look for Jean, she's already long gone. She had escaped in a tiny boat with some members of her crew. With no food or water, they floated helplessly for 6 days, and some crew members ultimately did not survive the escape. Finally, on the 7th day, Jean drifted onto English shores, half dead, but still alive enough to ruin King Philip VI's day. Upon landing in England, she was welcomed by King Edward III as a respected ally. With her ships and crew gone, she decides she had enough of the pirate life. 2 years later, her nemesis, King Philip VI, dies anyway, closing that chapter, and she meets and marries an English knight named Walter Bentley. They return to Brittany together, where she peacefully lived out the rest of her days, dying at the ripe age of 59. Which these days seems way too young, but for a mother of 7 in the 1300s who had also been, a freaking pirate, it was a pretty good run. Number 2, Jirozaemon. It's the end of the 17th century in Japan, and a wealthy charcoal dealer named Jirozaemon from the village of Sano is wandering around the bustling city of Edo. Running a successful business is tough, and Jiro needed some time off to recharge and thought the big city would be the best place to do just that. While walking around, he accidentally stumbles into the pleasure district of Yoshiwara. Whoops, how did that happen? And there, he finds himself surrounded by the most beautiful women who all smile at him as he passes by. Jiro cannot help but stare back in awe and wave sheepishly, as this was something he was totally not used to. You see, due to a case of smallpox he suffered as a child, his face was badly disfigured, and no woman back home would even look at him or give him the time of day. As he wanders around Yoshiwara, he spots a beautiful courtesan in the distance. He rushes over to get a better look, and she's hands down the most stunning woman he has ever seen. He follows her back to her establishment and learns her name is Yatsuhashi. She's an oiran, a courtesan of the highest class who only services nobles and the ultra-rich. As a successful businessman, Jiro had money, but merchants were on the lowest rung of the social ladder. Could he even have a shot to buy some time with this goddess of a woman? But to his surprise, Yatsuhashi smiles and accepts him. Now, it's important to note that at this time, the courtesans in this pleasure district had the right to turn away customers they didn't want to service. And so, for the first time in his life, Jiro seems to have found a woman who can look beyond his scarred face and see him for who he truly is. He instantly falls in love. Nothing in his life matters anymore, and he stays in Edo spending all of his time with Yatsuhashi. He begins to shower her with the most extravagant gifts. No expense is too much for the love of his life. But back home in Sano, without him around, Jiro's charcoal business begins to fall apart. The company soon goes bankrupt, and his home and all of his land are sold off to pay his debts. Without any new money coming in from his business, and having already spent all the money he had on Yatsuhashi, Jiro finds himself penniless, but he can't stop wandering around Yoshiwara obsessively trying to catch his love when she's walking about. One day, Jiro finally manages to catch Yatsuhashi walking in a procession of courtesans, and he calls out to her. She ignores him, and in that moment he comes to the painful realization that his relationship with her was strictly business. She never had any real feelings for him. She was just humoring him for his money. I poured my heart out, spent my fortune. I'd heard courtesans were not sincere, but I believed Yatsuhashi was different. How could I have been so stupid to trust her? The pain is unbearable. So on December 19, 1696, Jiro finds Yatsuhashi again walking through Yoshiwara in a procession, and in a final attempt yells out to her, "Please, could you just say one nice thing to me? I've lost everything because of you." Again, she ignores him and keeps walking. Finally recognizing he's truly lost everything, Jiro finally snaps. "How dare you ignore me after all this, you ungrateful wretch!" And he chases her to a tea house. Yatsuhashi is quickly escorted inside, but Jiro barges his way in and draws a short sword. According to some stories, it's a named blade called the Kagotsurube. "You've humiliated me enough!" he shouts, and he rushes at Yatsuhashi, who's making her way up a staircase. He lunges at the woman he once thought to be the love of his life, and with a single stroke, slices her in half. Her legs and waist tumble down the staircase while her hands grip its railing. Jiro runs up the stairs past his former lover and onto the roof, attempting to escape. The commotion attracts the police, and neighbors try to hit him with long sticks to get him down, but he's swinging his sword like a madman. Eventually, someone throws a bucket of water on him, which causes him to slip and fall to the ground, where he's quickly captured and later sentenced to death. Number 3. Jeffrey Hudson. It's 1619, and in the small town of Oakham, England, a boy named Jeffrey Hudson's born. While for the most part he looks like a completely normal newborn, his parents soon begin suspecting something is very wrong. Time passes and he learns to crawl, to walk, and to talk, but he never grows any taller than his birth height. At 3, he's still just 19 inches tall. Now, back in the 1600s, little people were considered barely above animals, and Jeffrey's father was well aware of this. Looking at his tiny boy running around, he could only see an incredibly difficult life in store for him. What would happen to little Jeffrey when he and his wife passed away? Who would take care of him? Luckily, due to his job as the keeper of the baiting bulls for the Duke of Buckingham, Jeffrey's father saw one path that could possibly give his son a somewhat respectable life. So when Jeffrey turns 7, his father brings him to the Duchess of Buckingham and presents him as a gift. See, little people, or dwarfs as they were known back then, were often collected by nobility as curiosities that were used to entertain guests. Jeffrey was blessed in the sense that though he was small, he was perfectly proportionate with no deformities or disabilities. He was, for all intents and purposes, just a little person. The Duchess stares at Jeffrey like she's seeing a shiny Pokemon in real life and immediately accepts him and he joins her court. Now, around this time, the Duke and Duchess were expecting a visit from the King and his new French bride, Queen Henrietta Marie, and they thought that Jeffrey would be the ultimate surprise and delight for their dinner guests. At the banquet, a large pie is placed on the table in front of the royal couple. The Queen stares at the pie, wondering what surprise might be hiding inside, when suddenly, on command, Jeffrey, dressed in a tiny suit of armor, bursts from the pie crust and starts aggressively dueling an invisible opponent with his tiny sword. The Queen finds this hilarious. How is someone this small even real? She must have him. And so the Duchess gives Jeffrey to the Queen and he travels back with her to London. Jeffrey joins the Queen's collection of oddities and quickly becomes her favorite. She makes sure he has the best food and accommodations. He gets the formal education of a noble and servants that he can call upon for whatever he needs. Somehow, against all odds, being tiny was not the curse he thought, and miraculously it's brought him a wonderful life. He develops a deep affection for his queen and works hard to put on the best acts he can for her guests. His hit routine was one where he partnered with one of the Queen's other curiosities, a man named William Evans, who was a giant that stood over 7 feet tall. At dinner parties, Evans would pull out a loaf of bread from one pocket and then pull Jeffrey out of his other pocket, who would then cut the bread and serve it. Jeffrey was given the nickname Lord Minimus, and though he initially enjoyed the spoils of the royal life, he slowly became resentful of the golden cage he had found himself in. He realized that no matter how educated he became or what skills he worked to acquire, he would always be treated like a joke and never truly accepted as an equal by anyone. But in 1642, Jeffrey found himself with the opportunity of a lifetime to prove he was more than just a court jester. See, while Jeffrey had been busy making nobles laugh, the Queen's husband, King Charles, had been busy alienating the entire parliament of his country. Charles believed he was God's chosen monarch, and rather predictably, this point of view was badly received by nearly everyone. And so by 1642, a massive civil war broke out. Supporting the king and his queen, Jeffrey fought to take a more active role in the war. He pleaded with the Queen for an official position in the royalist army, arguing that he was an expert horseman and a crack shot. The Queen eventually gives in and appoints the now 23-year-old Jeffrey to captain of the horse. While many in the court saw this as a joke, Jeffrey didn't care, and he took his new job and new title seriously. But in 1644, before he had any real shot to prove himself a man beyond his inches, the royalists were clearly losing this war, and the Queen flees to her homeland of France, bringing Jeffrey with her. In France, court life resumes in much the same fashion as before the war, but Jeffrey has no intentions of returning to the life of an oddity. He was now Captain Jeffrey Hudson. Lord Minimus was gone, and he made it clear to everyone that he would not tolerate any further mockery. Any man who insulted him would pay with his life. A man named Charles Crofts thinks that Jeffrey's declaration of dignity is all an act and bursts out laughing. No one knows what Crofts said to Jeffrey, but it pissed him off, and he challenges Charles to a duel. Still laughing, Charles accepts this challenge from the great Lord Minimus, thinking this is all a part of a joke that will have a huge punchline in the end. But Jeffrey was not f***ing around at all. The date of the duel is set for October, and it would be conducted with pistols on horseback. On the day of the duel, when it came time for weapons to be presented, Jeffrey pulls out his tiny custom pistol. Crofts snickers, reaches into his pocket, and dramatically reveals a squirt gun, earning applause and laughter from the crowd. But Jeffrey was done being laughed at. He tightened his grip on his pistol and orders for Crofts to be handed a real gun. Crofts is quickly outfitted with his own pistol and was like, "Wait, are you for real?" The two men then mounted their horses, ride to a distance, and face each other. The signal is given, and they each charge forward. Crofts fires first, missing Jeffrey's small frame, and with laughter from the crowd echoing in his ears, Jeffrey raises his pistol, aims, and fires. His bullet strikes Crofts in the middle of his forehead and sends him toppling backward off his horse, dead before he hits the ground. Bro, that's not funny at all. The crowd is shocked into silence. The Queen's dwarf has just murdered a noble. By this time, dueling was illegal in France, and Jeffrey was quickly arrested and tried for murder. He's saved at the last possible moment by Queen Henrietta, who negotiates for him to be exiled instead of executed. And so she and Jeffrey say their final goodbyes, and he sails off from France. Jeffrey soon learns just how good life was, being laughed at as one of the Queen's curiosities when he's quickly captured at sea by Barbary pirates. He's sold into slavery and spends the next 25 years as a slave in North Africa. He finally escapes and makes it back to England just in time for a severe anti-Catholic purge, and is thrown into prison for 2 years for being Catholic. He eventually is released and dies just a few short years later in 1682 penniless, and is buried in an unmarked grave. Now, this is all super depressing and all, but there is a conspiracy theory that this record of being captured by pirates is actually not what happened. See, Jeffrey made a surprise appearance at Queen Henrietta's funeral in 1669, leading some to suspect that the Queen safely hid him away the whole time.